Welcome to Maintainable, the podcast where we explore the art and sometimes the mess of software that lasts. We talk with seasoned practitioners who have wrestled with technical debt, untangled legacy code, and helped teams build sustainable, resilient systems. Because good software isn't just about shipping fast, it's about making it last. I'm your host, Robbie Russell. On this episode, we're asking, what makes a codebase resilient? How do we design for the developers who come after us, not just for today? And when is breaking things apart actually the wrong move? Evan Phoenix, CEO of Miren, joins me to explore these questions. We talk about the difference between prefactoring and refactoring, how to build confidence in our codebases, and what happened when his team split a monolith into multiple apps. We also dive deep into the challenges of open source, scope creep, and how to tell if a project is worth adopting into your application. Evan joins us from Los Angeles. Let's get into it. Evan Phoenix, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those, when you see it kind of things, but, let's get into it, right? Because I think that my take on this was actually originally, rather than knowing what it is, it was about how someone reacts to it, right? At least to me, I think about someone coming into the code base for the first time and being given a task and being able to complete that task in a reasonable amount of time, right? If you have that frame, so again, I guess to flip it, what's a characteristic of maintainable software? It's that things are obvious and compartmentalized such that a new person without a lot of domain knowledge can come in and make a change, right? I think that, and you get so many splinter effects from just trying to have that mindset.
I'm imagining that some people's listening might be thinking, well, that seems like a simplistic view of it, because you have to understand the domain or the organization you're joining and the existing software, and to kind of understand the business a little bit. So how much of the business domain should you understand before you can start being able to make contributions on that, say, that given task of hey, make a change in the code base?
I mean, it should be low, right? Because I think that if the argument is that you need to be well-versed in the business domain, or extremely well-versed in the business domain before you can make a change, what that tells me is that the code is not good about explaining why the code exists, right? Because if you're saying you need to understand that, if you're going to buy tractors, that you can only buy tractors on Thursday. That's just an industry thing. Tractors are only sold on Thursdays. And if I'm going into the code and I'm supposed to make a change related to the billing system, and I see that there's all of these things that are, if not Thursday, fail, they're just laced in random places, right? Then the domain of the business has basically permeated the code at such a level that I don't consider that well maintained, right? For instance, if you can only sell tractors on Thursday, there should be a thing that basically explicitly is a method, if you will, that says, can we sell today? And inside that method, it says, is today Thursday? And then everywhere else, we're saying, hey, if I can't sell today, raise an error. Great. We've done so much. In other words, you've sort of decoupled the domain so much. It helps a new person, but also just in terms of maintainability, you've done a lot in just trying to make sure that that's the case.
I really appreciate that particular example. I think framing it in a, can we sell today? And then digging into the logic behind that's beautiful. I love that.
Because again, you think about it, if you ask somebody to add a restriction into code, which we've all done, a one-liner, hey, make sure that you can only sell on Thursdays. There's going to be the intuition to say, oh, well, great. I'll just go add the, if today's not Thursday, then raise an error in the two places that it exists, right? But now it starts to go out. They're like, oh, why are you letting someone add some stuff to the cart on a Wednesday when they can't buy it today? Oh, great. Oh, I need to add that same thing into the cart adding logic. And then they're like, well, why do we even let them see that the cart's even a thing if it's not Thursday? Oh, great. Well, they added another place. And so you can see, and again, it's just a one-liner. So the thinking is oh, well, it's just one line. I can just spiral it out. But the why of the one line is more important than the one line itself at that point.
I think we have the title of our episode here. No, that's great. Can you think of any other examples where I think people might be able to wrap their head around that, but just out of curiosity, are there other types of tangible things where you might have some nested logic? Well, it's if it's this, and this, and this, and this, and then you still feel like you end up in teams often find themselves in these like complex switch statements or if conditional logic of trying to navigate that. And how do you think about like how to organize that sort of stuff?
I'm going to use, it's a term of art that I'm using a lot these days. It's called programming mouthfeel. There's this essence to when you're doing some work about how it's supposed to feel. And I think that you would ask 10 people and they would be like, oh, well, I like it when it looks like this. The thing that they're expressing is just the mouthfeel of that code, right? And so it's going to be a little bit different, but I think there's some guardrails on either side, right? So I'm actually going to start at the I want to make super maintainable software side, which actually gets you into more trouble than it's worth sometimes, which is prefactoring software, which is like, okay, great. I know I don't care how this code is going to be used, but I know that I need to basically go in and I can't have any nested loops. I can't have all this stuff, and I'm going to break everything out into methods. It's sort of the Kent Beck school of thought, if you will, right? Oh, I should be doing everything should be a method. Everything should be small and concise, right? You can do that. I think that when people do that, they get themselves into more trouble than it's worth because now they're like, oh, I have to write an interface for this. I have to adapt this for this and this, that, and the other thing. And it's sort of like the domain gets lost a little bit. Like you've sort of overexploded this problem, right? On the other hand, you get to the other side, which is just, I've got nested loops inside with logic that's buried inside of, like for every item in every cart, I need to do a thing. So you've got like, okay, great. I've got like 2 loops of things and then I've got some code in the middle there, right? I think that most people will be like, oh, maybe this thing should be extracted. The rule of thumb that I give is if I ever copy some existing code and I use it exactly the way that it was originally, that's the signal to say like, okay, great. Let me just take an extra 5 minutes. I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup. In other words, I'm just sort of going to apply the Boy Scout rule here, which is just like, I'm going to try to keep it cleaner than I found it. And so if you keep that mentality going, then I think what you end up finding is that you organically build the pieces that need to be maintainable, you make them maintainable, right? Like, again, someone's got a sidekick job somewhere that has, for every item in every shopping cart, do a thing. And that's the only time that they're ever going to do that thing. In some ways, maintainable software is almost never going to be about the inside loop of that thing. It's going to be about like, like the logic to detect abandoned shopping carts maybe needs to be called from 3 places. And so rather than copying the logic about how to do it, like you just put it in a place, just make it a thing, like give it a name. This is the functionality related to shopping cart cleanup. Great. And you call it from 4 places.
I'm curious about, given your background in software development, what's your take on the metaphor technical debt? Do you use it or do you think it's a useful term or metaphor?
I feel like we're sort of getting into the world of it being used as a cudgel in the industry at this point, to beat people with, like, oh, don't like to beat them over the head with, like, and don't have technical debt. That looks like some technical debt to me, right? And I get it. I understand the idea. I guess maybe I'll take a step back and think about technical debt from maybe a more philosophical perspective. Even if I'm the only one who's ever written a piece of software, I have tons. I'm a professional as well as consummate hobby programmer, and so I'm constantly coming back to my own code that no one else has seen ever. It was only for me, and I'm only the one who's ever worked on it. And I will come back to it and I'll be like, what was I doing? This is funny. This is strange. I didn't decide to do this, that, and the other thing, right? Even if I decided to make it well refactored, even if I decided to do all that kind of stuff. And so is my inability to immediately grasp it, does that make it technical debt? What we get into here in the term technical debt is, are we talking about code that you have swapped to disk in your brain that you need to like take a minute to be like, how did this work again? Oh, right. It was this, that, and the other thing or whatever, right? Just that inability to hold it in your head. Does that make a technical debt? I don't think so. Personally, I think that just means that we have limited capacity, right? And so technical debt has to apply to like a whole code base. And I think that the answer is found in the point of maintainable software, which is when you're coming back to a thing, and you're like, how did I make this work? And you don't have any knowledge. Again, you're just beginner brain on a problem domain again, because even if it's your own code, how quickly can you look at it? How quickly can you be like, oh yeah, I was doing this again. And when you go to make a change, like maybe that's the reason you're back there, how protected are you, the current you, from the sins or the whatever you did in the past, right? So like a lot of maintainable software is writing tests, because if I go to change a thing, I need the feedback. How do I get the feedback that I broke a thing, that I did the right thing, that I violated some constraint that is, not obvious in the code that the tests contain, right? And so that's why I think that, at the top of this, I talked about bringing a new person onto the team. But that's us half the time, right? Half the time you're coming back to a piece of code brand new that you haven't seen in 6 months that you're like, what was I doing here again, right?
I think this speaks to having, say, confidence in that the changes you're going to make won't break unexpected parts of the system. And so like testing, your reference is one way, provide some, or at least mitigate some risks there, or provide some confidence for the team. Can you think of other ways that teams have maybe been a part of, or in retrospect, wish you had done differently to help the team build confidence? If you're in a situation where you don't have a lot of reliance on a lot of existing tests, or you're trying to how do we get to this more confident place versus like everybody being a little bit worried that they're tiptoeing around and not breaking things?
I think that the testing is a spectrum. I think that everyone does it. The testing tent incorporates everybody who writes software, because if you didn't test your software, no one ran it. Like running the software in production is a test that it works, right? So if it was just output only software, okay, great. Yeah, you're not doing testing, but it's also not, it was just bytes in a disk file somewhere, right? So everybody is testing. So when someone is like, okay, how can I have confidence with this thing? Let's say I have been, the way that I have been building confidence up to now is I've been deploying to production. I don't even have feature flags. I'm just the first one to go look at it just to see, oh, did it work? Okay, great. I don't have to revert it. I don't have to do whatever. Like, this is scary. Like, again, you're getting yourself into you're putting a lot of trauma on yourself to test this code. And so that's what the crux of it is. It's like, how do you test the code? How do you find breakages in the most emotionally stable way? Emotionally, like literally for the person who's writing the code. And so let's say you don't have anything. That's all you've got. I would tell that person, well, just maybe write a thing that lets you check to make sure that the site is working easier. Let's say that they've been going in there, they've been opening up their browser and they've been going and they've been reloading this one page, the cart page, we'll just use that again, and making sure that the cart page loads correctly and they go on. I would say write a script that curls the cart page and make sure that it works. Even if all you're doing is you're going to go in and you're going to use Nokagiri or whatever you're going to use in order to like make sure that the right divs are there and the checkout button and all that kind of stuff. Write that. Just start there. Because then at the very minimum, after you deploy it, you run your test and it says, hey, it worked. Everything's good. I think that you can even just start from that perspective and work backwards. I am actually a big proponent, I write a lot of large distributed systems, and it's difficult sometimes to feel like my unit tests portray the actual guise of what is really happening with this code, right? And so I actually am an advocate for write yourself an integration test that runs at midnight and runs on a thing. It runs once a day for everybody in your team, and it does a big thing, and maybe it takes an hour, and you don't care how long it takes. But every morning, everybody can come in and say like, oh yeah, I know the integration tests ran last night. I don't care how long they took. I didn't care what crazy setup they had to have, but they ran last night, and everything was great. Great. I feel emotionally stable about what we did yesterday. I can move forward, right? I can tell you, having done that in the past, that when that integration test has been running great for months and everyone's sort of forgetting about it, and then when it breaks and you find a problem, you're like, oh God, thank God we had this thing. Like it's a bug inside a bug inside a bug that we never would have found otherwise.
Where do you find that balance between putting a lot of emphasis on the integration side of tests and versus the unit side of unit testing?
What we get into here is, and you said confidence earlier, and I think that that's the key portion of this, right? So we're the humans still writing the software, at least for now. And so part of what goes into writing software is confidence in what you have done, that it is the correct thing. And you call that the software lifecycle, iteration lifecycle, whatever it is, right? So I'm writing code and I want to know that the thing that I just wrote like seconds ago is the correct thing. And the faster I can know that it was the correct thing, that gives me the confidence to say like, okay, I did that thing. I can move on to the next thing. And so that's where the unit tests are great, because the unit tests are all about, I wrote a thing that said, we'll use our can I sell today. I wrote a test that passed in a time for a Thursday and it said, no, I can't sell today. Great. I feel great about that code. I've got confidence in that segment of code. Now I can go on and I can use it other places and I could know that thing works. That thing works the way that it does, right? And so it's all about confidence and the ability to continually iterate. So if I write that one thing and I test it and it looks good, great. I know that I can confidently move on to the next thing, right? At some point, again, when the systems get large, it becomes tedious and cumbersome to write these unit tests. Like I have some unit tests that start an entire system to test one thing. And like, yeah, I mean, it's onerous sometimes and they don't get written. But at the very minimum, you want to say like, I tested a lot of these things, right? I need to have some confidence. I tested this, I tested that, I tested this, I tested, maybe I didn't test all the combinations of things, but I tested them. So I've got a degree of confidence. Now I'm going to write a thing that's just, maybe it's the integration test that runs once a day. Maybe it's a thing that like I don't run normally, but like I can run it manually. Like I can say like, hey, before lunch, I run the thing that takes 20 minutes that like tests that all the things are wired up together. And it doesn't test everything. It just tests that like, hey, they can be wired up together and they can perform a task. Great. Now I've got confidence that those things can be wired up together. So it's all about finding those points in confidence that allow you to continually iterate. And so it's not about like, oh, I need to have 100% test coverage because you still have value at the end of the day. And maybe maybe 100% test coverage doesn't help you deliver that value. The 100% test coverage is really there to give you confidence. And if you don't need that, then don't have it. Just find where that gives you confidence.
Hey listeners, it's Robbie here. You know, it wasn't all that long ago. I'd find myself debugging a weird issue in one of our clients' Rails apps. I log into one platform to track down the error, only to realize it was tied to some performance issue. And guess what? That meant hopping over into a completely different tool and trying to match things up based off of timestamps, if I was lucky. And let me tell you, my productivity didn't exactly thank me for that. Enter AppSignal, our podcast sponsor, and the tool that eliminates all that back and forth. They bring error tracking, performance monitoring, host metrics, custom metrics, uptime monitoring, and logging into one seamless platform. It's a single source of truth that helps keep your app running like a well-rehearsed symphony. Whether you're working with Ruby, Elixir, Node, Python, or tracking front-end errors in JavaScript, AppSignal has your back. They're always adding support for more languages and frameworks too. And here's the best part. AppSignal won't break the bank. Plans start at just $23 US a month. Plus, they're ISO 27001 certified and fully GDPR and HIPAA compliant, so your data is safe. Oh, and because you're a loyal Maintainable listener, you can use the promo code Maintainable at checkout for 10% off your first year. So head over to appsignal.com, tell them that your good friend Robbie from Maintainable sent you, and start making your app sing. You're talking a little bit about how maybe say like a unit test might just start become a much bigger thing where you spend a lot of time setting up a bunch of things so that you can test a few small things. For those listening that are, regardless of the frameworks and languages that they're working on, if they're thinking about like, well, we don't have a lot of automated testing right now, and they can probably wrap their head around maybe working on some of those integration things, like just from the outside testing it, but like it's really difficult to start doing the more granular stuff because there's so much existing code and how this all pieces together that it just feels very feels like a big lift to get started on the small stuff because it's actually really complicated already, and there's not a lot of necessarily a lot of books and literature and like here's the best practice on how to dive into a legacy code base and start adding small tests to things that are already kind of really complicated from like how the domain model is set up.
I think that in all those cases, I tell a person, you've only got so many hours in the day. Let's just like focus on what, like, yes, you got a lot of code. It's totally untested. I understand that you're like, that makes you uncomfortable. What I would say is like, what are you doing today? Oh, I need to add this, that, and the other thing. Okay, well, let's make a brand new test suite, totally empty, right? Like every language, every framework at this point has some way to integrate a test suite. And if not, let us know. But you're working in Brainfuck or something like that doesn't have a test framework. I want to hear about it. But regardless, most of them have you can go and say like, how do I start a test suite? And then just write one. Don't get ahead of yourself. Don't think that like, it doesn't have value unless I'm doing it everywhere. It has value always, period, right? So like, even if the thing today you're doing was just making sure that it's not just Thursdays, it's now Tuesdays and Thursdays because of this, what, and the other thing, you need to change that one function to make it Tuesdays and Thursdays, make a new one. Write a brand new function called checks to make sure it works on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And then wherever you needed to go, call that new function. Just slowly do it. Don't get ahead of yourself. Don't feel like it has, again, don't feel like it has no value unless there's a totality to it, because that's not the situation. You can incrementally add testing value. You can do it every single day. You can do it on every little thing that you add.
That's some good advice for folks listening. I'm going to switch topics a little bit to when we were preparing for this conversation, I heard about that you worked on a Monolith project, an app. It happens to be Ruby on Rails, and the podcast listeners are not all Rails developers, but for the purpose of the conversation, but that was split into two, I believe, for maintainability purposes. But I believe maybe the aftermath was a little more painful than everybody expected. So tell us more about this experience. What happened?
It was a big monolithic Rails app, and which contained, as they all do, some back-end functionality and then the actual public-facing front end. And the app had gotten large enough that there were really two separate teams, right? So in fact, there was really a third user in this. There was the merchant, there was the developer, and then there was the customer, right? And so it felt like they were building merchant tools. Hey, how do you do this, that, and the other thing? And so that was starting to get built up over here, right? And so you were starting to hire in teams where they were just working on the merchant tools portion of this thing. And then you're still hiring people to work on the consumer side, right? So those, we've got a little bit of Conway's Law here, right? You end up having two teams, right? And then you're like, oh, I got two teams. I need to be able to have the software mimic the structure of those teams, right? And so then they really okay, we're going to bifurcate it. We're going to basically say they copied over the code for the back end and said, okay, you can do this, and you can iterate on it, and here's your version of it. And then here's the front end, and you got it, and you can iterate on this. They really, as they split it, they really did a thing where instead of splitting it all the way, they sort of stopped halfway, because where they stopped was at the database layer. That was such a bad decision in retrospect, because what they ended up having to do then was play an incredibly complex dance around the models and the migrations and all that kind of stuff. And they did not unify the models in one place as a reflection of what the database had. Each individual app had their own copy of the models. And so they would get changed and updated, and, they were doing validations inside the models. And so the backend has a validation that this has to be true, but it only reads it, and the front end writes it, and the front end would write records that would fail the validation on the back end, because again, those two teams were separate. And so they were like, oh, well, we need this thing. And I forgot that there's another team that's actually manipulating this data. And so they weren't separate, right? There was there's this illusion of being separate. And we ended up doing a bunch of work to try to figure out okay, do we need to move the models into a common repo that's shared, and that you have to have another thing? If you want to update the models, you have to. Really, what it ended up being was so much work for so little value. In other words, they felt like because they had two separate teams, they needed to have two separate apps, because they needed to be able to deploy separately. They need to have different, a value structure about what the deployment meant and what all that sort of stuff. Who is reviewing commits and this, that, and the other thing. And they would have been far better off making different choices, not code-based related choices about that stuff, right? I don't think that it had it then, but if you're using GitHub for code reviews, for instance, you can have a code reviewers thing that says, this directory is these people, this directory is those people, right? Great. Use that, right? I've worked in monoliths where that works great. You're saying okay, I don't need to worry about what a team over there is doing, even though we're all inside the same code base. The other thing is, maybe what you're doing is you're saying, okay, the reason to separate was partially because the front end wants to deploy once a week, and the back end wants to deploy once a day. Don't change the code for that. Have two separate deployments. Have a front end deployment that deploys the same code, but it deploys to servers that only serve the front end. And you have another set of servers that deploys code that is only serving the back end, right? You can solve it in many different ways. And I think it really was a situation of Conway's Law and the code trying to represent the organizational structure they had the best intentions, but it was just such a absolute bear. And it hung over their heads for a long time, we ended up basically being like, okay, like we can't even touch that code base now because there's so many, there's like gremlins everywhere. You're like, is this the real value? Is this the real validation? And so the people will be like, oh, I got to write new microservices, right? That was sort of the journey of that company. They started writing microservices because they're like, I can't trust what's going on inside the monolith because of this weird bifurcation.
I'm curious if in that example, maybe mentioning that there was a consumer side and the merchant side, were there also different maybe JavaScript frameworks being used at the same time between those two teams? Or were there other considerations that, because I've seen that happen where teams are like, well, in the back end, we're using this one platform and the team wants to start experimenting with a new framework for the public consumer side or what have you. And so we're going to try to keep that all in sync, and like with the versions of Rails kept in sync as well. And like there's a lot of other, you're also then doing 2 Rails upgrades, I guess, maybe in parallel. And like, how can you share the work there or not? And I don't know, I understand why teams sometimes go down that path, but then it's also like, this is an interesting kind of a use case of that, or maybe not an example to kind of reflect on, but I'm just thinking like, can you recall any other factors that might have also played outside of like validations on both sides or something?
I don't recall, but I do know that they definitely got into all of that. Like, oh, well, like I changed this style, I changed this component, and that happened to be being used on the back end, and now that broke or whatever because they could expect it to be used inside a container div or whatever it might be, right? You constantly have those sorts of things. But once they did the weird bifurcation, now absolutely they're dealing with like, okay, well, like we need to upgrade the Rails version, and what the natural thing would happen in post bifurcation, you'd have the natural thing where you'd have like, well, this gem got updated in the front end, like acts as actable. You remember all the acts as gems, right? So we'd have acts as whatever got upgraded to a new major version in the front end because why not? Like they just needed it and it felt right. But that changed this behavior subtly. That meant that didn't work in the back end. And so this back end is now they can't upgrade it because they're expecting this behavior. And it's just, again, the idea, I think you have to come back to like the chrysalis of why to do it. The chrysalis of why to do it originally was they're like, we need more flexibility. That was their core thing, is we need more flexibility about how to do this. And I guess my take is that lots of times that flexibility is not free. And you as a team or a manager making that decision are better off saying that we're not going to do that, and there are restrictions. There are these things that you can't do. Like you have to stay this, so you have to do this, that, and the other thing. And here's the benefit of doing that. We won't have to do X, Y, and Z. We won't have to do that. And some of that comes with just wisdom of a good manager or a good tech lead to do that sort of thing.
I'm also curious, that in that scenario, it sounded like the teams were growing. And so that was kind of like a part of that. Do you recall ever being part of conversations about like, well, what happens if the team's smaller one day?
No, never. I mean, I mean, that's the classic, the arrow only goes one direction. No, I don't recall. I mean, I don't think that was a real consideration. I think that like what was crazy to me in retrospect is that the splitting of it also meant that there was these 2 separate views of the business domain, right? When you had one code base, everybody had to have one singular view of what the business domain was because this app represented that business domain. Like people weren't writing a bunch of specs, like they weren't trying to put down the values and the concerns of the business domain and then put that into code. They were just, again, we can only sell on Thursdays. Great. That goes in the code. It wasn't captured anywhere else. Right. And so when you have that big monolith, when you have that thing, that is all of the business domain information. And by splitting it, now you had these 2 different views of the business domain that were naturally just creep. They would go in different directions slightly and in incompatible ways, and then be like, oh god, we gotta like, no, you're letting people upload images that are greater than this size. The front end can't display images that are greater than this size. Why are you doing that? Oh god, okay, we gotta like reorient ourselves back around, right? And I think part of it is this. Again, there was no harbinger, there was no thing holding the business domain other than these apps, and now you have 2 different views of it.
Let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about what you're now working on. So I know that you're now at the early stages of launching Miren. So I know that you can't share too much just yet, but I'd love to hear about the mindset shift from working on established projects to building something new.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I love building things anew. I think I said earlier on that like I'm a consummate professional and hobby programmer. The analogy I've given for my view of writing software is for a long time is the same as a hobby painter. A person who has a little studio in their garage and they paint pictures just for themselves. And you go into their garage and you see half started canvases everywhere, right? Like I consider that my hobby programming domain. I have a project. I haven't worked on it in years. This is a while back, but I love the beginning of the project so much. And I hated the middle so much that every time I got to the middle, I started it over and I just did the beginning again because like, again, I was just doing it for myself. I wasn't doing it for anybody else. And so starting a new venture is extremely exciting and tons of fun. And it's actually, for me, less imposing than I think a lot of people. For me, it's all about how do I keep the energy and the excitement of those first month, week, days, whatever it is, longer term, right? In other words, how do I make sure that it stays fresh and exciting and not a drudge? That's really where the space that I live in. And then doing that when you're just a hobbyist and you're writing a thing just for yourself is more difficult, honestly, than working inside a company. Because when you're working inside a company, I know, for instance, that I'm the only one working on it right now, but like I'm going to hire people. And when I hire people, one of the things that I'm going to say to them is, I need you to be excited about the middle. I need you to be excited about how we're going to maintain this. I need you to be excited about this, that, and the other thing. Is that something that you're interested in? And if they say no, then they're like, okay, well, maybe we'll have to figure it out if they're the right fit. And if they say no, I only love shiny stuff, I might say like, we've got a lot of shiny stuff, people. Like maybe we need a middle of the road person, right? And so I think that in a way, my mindset shifts a little bit to, how do I make sure that I can operate a business that is building software in a ways that fits the mindsets of the people who are working on it?
We'll be back with our conversation with Evan in just a moment. Hey, it's Robbie. Real quick, I just want to say thanks for making time to listen to Maintainable. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please pass the link to a friend or leave a review on Apple Podcasts to help spread the word. It really helps. And if you know someone who you think could make a great guest, let me know. Just shoot me an email to robbie@maintainable.fm. All right, let's get back to our interview with Evan Felix. I'm curious about, haven't started a new project myself necessarily in quite a while now, and for various reasons. Well, here's I'm just kind of a slight tangent on that. Part of that is because something I've come to realize is that a lot of the projects I've started over the years, whether it be code-related projects or personal hobby projects, they always, I look back on them and I'm like, oh, none of these have a clear expiration point. They always seem to be an ongoing thing until I get bored or disinterested in something else, and they don't have like a time box to it, where I'm like, I'm going to do this thing for 3 months and then I'm going to be done and move on to something else. They just become this ongoing project. And so if it works, that just keeps going. And I'm like, I don't know how to get out of, do I want to get out of this? Am I still interested? So I get into this. So I find myself right now being really resistant to taking on and following some of those ideas, because I'm like, am I giving myself a bunch of to-dos that I'm going to be worrying about in 10 years from now? Or am I just interested right now? And so I'm like, is that the itch I want to scratch right now? So kind of like where my headspace is at the moment.
I totally get that. And I've been there a million times as well. I think when I was working on Rubinius, and that project started almost 20 years ago now, and I was still, I was a hobby programmer. That's how Rubinius started. It's just a hobby project. And the first many years of working on Rubinius, I actively quelled desire to work on side projects. I was like, nope, I have to save my mental energy for this main thing. I don't want to get myself sidetracked. What I learned over time was, that's okay, that's a good instinct, but that it doesn't mean that all of those ideas and thoughts should go nowhere either, right? So like, that's why it was around that time that I realized like I started to use the hobby painter analogy, because when you have this instinct to be like, oh, this is interesting. Well, the thing that I learned about myself is don't take the interest I have at that exact moment as the indication that it is a good idea. It might be a terrible idea. That doesn't mean I'm not interested in it right now, right? And just see it out. See out the energy. See out the interest that you have right now, right? Like, don't worry about if there's a middle. Don't worry about if it's sustainable. Don't worry about you might start it and you might be over it by the end of the day. Great. Sometimes that's the best possible scenario, right? You've sort of like, you scratch that intellectual curiosity and you've gotten it out of your system. You're like, okay, great. That is a bad idea. Great. Super. Move on with the rest of my life. Sometimes you might be like, I really like this. I wanna keep going. I want to keep going. Like have a project that I started 10 years ago that's still my GitHub is just all abandoned projects. Not totally abandoned, but there's so many on there that are just like a thing that I did for 2 weeks. There's a VirtualBox fork on my GitHub that is a thing that I worked on for 2 weeks. I really wanted to know how VirtualBox did this one specific thing, and I went in to go try to go change it to understand how it worked. Did I think that that was a realistic scenario that I was going to like release this thing? No, but I wanted to satisfy the intellectual curiosity. And so shifting my mindset to saying, this doesn't have to be anything. This, like, if I'm interested in it right now, that's fine. Let that be what it is. Don't make this into something it's not. And so that has really helped me both write tons of throwaway code, but also not get too hung up on what it means to write code. Write it for its own sake.
I think that touches on I can't remember where I heard this recently, but thinking about like, would you do it if nobody knew you were doing it in a way? And I guess like might have a public repo pop up on GitHub, and if you're following Evan on GitHub, that's not uncommon thing. So, but I think but you're not necessarily announcing it to the world. Like, hey, I got this new project. I'm creating look at the README, created a logo for this thing. I bought the domain name. Granted, I did have an idea last night. I bought a domain name for the first time in a long time this morning, right before we did this. I'll share that at some point, maybe, or maybe not. Maybe I got a little excited about it. I did. I'm like, ooh, I'm going to buy the domain name. Maybe that'll get me on the path to keep this still interested in a couple of days, or I will keep paying for that domain for the next 10 years. Having said that, so there's definitely a couple other topics I wanted to get to while we have our time. So back to Miren a little bit, can you touch on, if you're building out a new product type service thing, I think you mentioned it was like an open source project. How do you measure up like feeling like this is going to be good enough to release the first version? And how do you manage think about scope creep if you're kind of all doing it yourself?
I love this question because it's a thing that I have been absolutely just wrestling with the last 3 weeks or so. I'm going to come back to my own personal mantra, which is because I think that helps me answer this question. My own personal mantra, which I found after years in therapy, was no one's expecting more from me than I'm giving right now. I am the hardest on myself. I will tell myself that all the time because I am definitely my worst critic. And as long as I keep that in mind, keep that in frame, that helps me view what I'm working on and view my output differently than I would otherwise. In the same way that, I guess if I were to go look at a product that just got released or a repo that says 0.1 or whatever it is, am I going to be really generous with myself about what that does and where the bugs are and how broken it is? Yes. So I should be that generous with myself similarly. And so what I think of it right now in terms of scope creep is not, does it do all the things? Because it's not going to do all the things. So I'm only working on it right now. And instead, what I view it as, is it enough that I can tell a good story, regardless of how complete or bug-free it is? And because I think that, especially early on for, working on an MVP, working on something that is pre-public view, when you have that public view, you want to be able to tell a story. Why did I build this? Well, how is it different than the other things, right? And that story matters as much as, maybe even more than, the quality of bug-free code. You see that a lot. There's tons of projects out there that their focus is how do I make a huge splash regardless of how complete this thing is? And I'm not all on that camp. I think I still want someone to give it a critical eye and be able to kick the tires on day one. But I keep that in mind all the time to be like, oh, it's not good enough. It's not, I haven't tested it in all these scenarios yet, or this, that, and the other thing. And just say that. Just say, I'm releasing this thing. I think it's great. Here's where I've tested it. If you test it in other scenarios and it breaks, I want to hear about it. And in some ways, the engagement that you can get from a person who tries a thing and breaks and tells you is the most valuable currency in the world. Because what it says is that a person has carved out a time in their life to try a thing and to give you feedback. And there's almost nothing that you could expect from a person. That's the sort of the high bar, in my opinion.
So, maintaining an open source project brings a lot of different set of challenges compared to working on private or internal software. So what have you found makes open source software easier or maybe harder to maintain?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes it easier in that what we're just talking about. I think they're more forgiving a little bit, with open source software. I think that the ability to go in and see it and change it and understand why a bug exists, I think as it softens people's attitude. It definitely softens my own personal feelings about software. I'm using this and I'm downloading it in the same way that like I'm releasing a 0.1 and it's broken or whatever. And you get into another benefit of open source then, which is release the versions all the time, right? In other words, don't get precious with it, right? If you release a thing and the first person who tells you 5 minutes later is that it broke their core workflow and you're like, oh shit, release another one 5 minutes after that. Like, don't worry about it. Like, just move. Like, the core philosophy of open source is just move forward. Like, there's almost nothing else to it. Just go in a forward direction. And as long as you're consistently moving in a forward direction and you have some idea of what you want to build, then do that. I think that some of the challenges are, there's a sense of that people end up having a sense of entitlement. Like, for instance, if you have a successful piece of open source software, people feel like, oh, well, I depend on this. And why aren't you doing this, that, and the other thing? And there's so much that people could say about entitlement in open source development. And I think that one thing that you, at an open source developer, have to remember is don't let the entitlement get to you. Like, yes, people are going to say things. People are going to I'll give you a timid example here. I have a project that I wrote 10 years ago called JSON Patch. It's a Go library for managing or applying JSON patch formats, which is a whole RFC. If listeners should go check it out. And I wrote it for a thing that I didn't build. But I wrote this piece of software and I put it up there and I was like, great, this is a thing. If people want to use it, great. If people don't want to use it, I don't care. And then what ended up happening was some people found it and then it got sort of accidentally, well, not accidentally, someone intentionally did this. It got included as a core component inside Kubernetes. So Kubernetes, when you go apply a patch, it uses this library that I wrote. And I was thrilled that they would choose my code rather than just going their own direction. Great. But I had it and I would work on it over the course, over the years. I wasn't using it for anything. I was just maintaining this piece of software that I wasn't using. And I was okay with that. And I got to a point where people were sending in features and they're sending ideas and stuff like that. And one of the things that I decided was, I'm going to try and experiment. And I said, this software is done. It's done. I'm done. It does satisfies a domain. And that RFC, that domain is defined in two separate RFCs. We are done. I will accept bugs, but I'm not adding new functionality. It is a finished domain. It is a complete piece of software. And people would ask me, I saw recently, someone posted a comment on a issue that I hadn't looked at saying the comment saying, don't bother, this software is dead. And I was like, I responded with, first of all, it's not dead. It's complete. It does the thing. It does the domain. Like, they wanted to know why. How come it doesn't do this, that, and the other thing? It should be great. It should be doing all these other things. And I was like, no, this is a finished piece of software, right? And the person commenting, don't worry, this is dead software. It got to me. It got to me a little bit, right? And I had to, I responded very quickly and slightly emotionally, if I'm honest. And that is one of the things that happens as, you're putting yourself out there, right? I think that and this is not just open source, this is every developer out there, is you have to find a way of having just enough emotional detachment from that thing that you put out there. And this is true for I consider software development an artistic blue collar occupation. Right. We think of ourselves as artists, and I think that we are because it's a largely imaginative escapade that we're in. But you learn it by doing it. It's a trade, right? Like, you just get out there, and in the same way that there's artful plumbing as well. It's just there's probably not a lot of it, whereas there's much more artful software, but it is still a trade. And so you have to have enough of an emotional attachment that when someone says, hey, this thing sucks, that you'd be like, okay, great. I'm sorry that it doesn't do what you want. I'm sorry that you got it for free. You're happy to go another route, right? I think that I have seen so many people run afoul of their own values by feeling like, oh, I have to defend this thing because this thing is me. And the sooner that someone can, and this gets back into maintainability as well, right? Someone comes up and it says, hey, I submitted a patch that cleans up this thing because I couldn't understand it. And that if you take that emotionally as like, oh, they couldn't understand it because my code sucks and fuck that guy, whatever, right? Like, you're not helping, right? It's not helping. And so, like, that's why it's this hard, artistic trade sort of give and take.
There's a couple of things that you touched on there I'd love to dig into. One, the artistic blue collar. Coincidentally, about a little over a week ago, I think I posted something on LinkedIn. It was one of my most viewed posts on LinkedIn, I think maybe ever. And it basically started off with like, we're blue collar. And boy, did that stir up some stuff. But aside from that, so I like the little framing of like bringing the, prefacing with the artistic part there. I think that's really useful. And yes, this is a trade. And my thinking there is like, I always feel like in a weird way, our industry seemed to have a certain level of overconfidence in ourselves, or just more like we're doing some really amazing thing. And I'm like, most of us are just taking care of maintaining software, hence the podcast, hence like we're plumbers, janitors, taking care of code, right? And our infrastructure.
That doesn't mean you can't like it, by the way.
No, so that's true. And my thinking there was just more around, you mentioned like being a hobbyist as well. And I think that's interesting, but I'm also thinking around one of the struggles I've had with our industry is I feel like in a weird way, there's been a lot of doing this for several decades now is like, as we try to, it seems like as a lure for bringing more people into our industry, like, hey, come join us, be software developers. This is where all the makers and creators are. And I'm like, are we selling this concept of, hey, if you're a really creative person, you're going to be building and inventing things all the time? Or I'm like, well, a lot of the work is like, make some small changes and like, make sure it's Thursday in the code, and it's like, you can still be creative in that, but also gets into that, like, well, there's that line between creative and cleverness. And it gets a little, so I've had interns in the past or junior developers are like, well, at one point I'm going to kind of graduate beyond this fixing bugs, maintenance type stuff. And I'm going to get to do this other stuff that I kind of was told that I would get to do. And I'm like, I don't think most of us do that. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm sorry that
it doesn't exist.
Someone said that. So I think about that a lot and just be like, again, part of the podcast. I'm like, this is what we're all dealing with day in and day out. It's not about like what's new and shiny all the time. Although we do need the people that are kind of exploring and figuring out new things. And that's, people like you are doing that. So thank you for that.
I just want to say real fast, I think there's a shade to all this, right? Like, I think that, like, I call it a trade. I call it blue collar because like we've traditionally called sort of trades blue collar, but that's unequivocal in my mind because the jobs, I don't know what you did for your schooling, but like I have worked for some of the best programmers I've ever worked with were like medieval literature majors in college. And they got into programming, they got into tech because it was interesting to them. And it was a thing that they could go out and they could learn. They could get a job as an intern and they could move up. And I actually wish that we had real apprenticeships in software because I think that other trades have solved this problem by having apprenticeship programs. We really should be doing that because it is really what we're talking about when we're saying like, can I hire a junior programmer? That being said, there's still the entire breadth of work that happens. Just because a friend, Adam Keyes, always calls himself a professional typist. There's the typing part. There's the fixing bugs part. There's the actual like, hey, I have to do this thing today. I have to do this Jira ticket. I have to do whatever, right? And then there's the higher up level, which is like, can I figure out why this bug exists? How does it do? And you start to get into sort of the intellectual / artistic endeavor, right? And everybody who works in code runs the entire spectrum. There are people who absolutely love fixing bugs because they love the intellectual pursuit of correcting, of finding the reason. Like, Sherlock Holmes was a manic personality because he just loved finding out what the heck happened, right? Like, that sort of person exists, right? And then you have a spectrum that runs all the way up into was effectively like a product manager who codes, right? A person who's like, what if someone could come to the website and instead of it having to be Thursday, they could make a request to buy this thing on Thursday and we will just hold it for them. And this is why it'd be great. And I've come up with this idea, and it could be styled like this, or we could do this, that, and the other thing. And again, now we're getting into the artistic endeavor, and maybe they don't code that. Maybe they're just the one who comes up with ideas. I think that, like, I've worked with tons of people who really love executing vision and don't love coming up with vision. They're like, I love to execute. I love for someone to say, like, hey, this is what we're going to do. I want these to work this way together. And they're like, oh, glad I didn't have to come up with this. I can't wait to execute on it. And so that entire pantheon of personalities exists inside programming.
For those listening that are thinking about maybe their team's trying to hire more developers, and as they grow their team or start adding to their team, but maybe they don't know what types of people on that spectrum they need, or they might not necessarily know where they're at yet, depending on how would you kind of encourage them to think about how to ruminate on that a little bit? But like, what are we looking for in this particular role? Like, we need someone just to be a really good bug fixer because that's the pain point we're dealing with right now, or do we need someone that can do that but also be visionary? Or
hopefully when you're setting out to hire somebody, you have a job description in mind, right? But I think that what you find is that it's important to be clear about where the job is now and where it's going to be in 6 months. It doesn't have to be where it is going to be in 3 years. I actually subscribe to the theory that you can't make a plan that's more than about 6 months out anyway. And so, if someone comes in and they're like, well, what do you want out of, what are you, a human, a flesh and blood person with desires and goals, and what do you want out of this job? And they say, oh, well, I really want to learn how to be a programmer because I've got this as a goal. And then you say to them, great, I can help you reach that goal here. Or you say to them, this place probably won't help you reach that goal. That doesn't mean that you won't get there all the way there, but we just don't have that for you in this role right now. What you're going to be doing is you're going to be, taking JIRA tickets and fixing bugs, and you're going to learn a lot. But I don't think that we can revisit that goal in 6 months, but I don't think we're going to get there in the next 6 months. And what I find is that people are so receptive to that sort of openness and that sort of transparency about what the job is, not what it could be, right? So from that perspective, to come back to your original question, like, how do you know who you should hire? I think that we're having this is sort of a cultural reflection rather than a real answer, but hire some more junior developers, people. Please, for the love of Pete, because I am constantly hearing this refrain about like, oh, I don't know how to hire any junior developers anymore because I've got AI. Guess what? You're going to get old, friend. And when you get old, if you don't hire any junior developers, there's going to be no one behind you to come forward, right? Senior developers, you don't pick us on trees. We're not come out of a cryo freeze from a distant planet, right? We were junior developers. You got to give people a shot. The thing I think that is true, I have worked with HashiCorp where I worked previously, had an internship program, and I didn't care that much about it when it started, and I couldn't care. I care more about it than maybe I should, having exited HashiCorp, because we had these amazing college students that came in as interns, and they were so bright and so open, and we were transparent with them. Hey, this is what we're going to be working on. This is what you're going to work on in the next 6 months. We hope to see you back next summer. Hopefully we can find a full-time position for you. And a number of them came back for full-time positions, because what we found was full-time junior developers, first of all, unfortunately has gotten a little bit of a derogatory title at this point, junior developer. But what you're saying is they just don't have a lot of experience. They don't have a lot of wisdom that comes with them. But I've seen so many staff developers that have less wisdom than a junior developer, right? Like half the time, junior developers that come in and who are like, I want to learn how to do this, and I don't know any of these things yet. When I hire somebody onto a team, I don't hire someone who's a domain expert, largely. When I'm hiring and I'm looking for people, I don't go out and I say like, you need to have 10 years experience with the Z editor. And you need to be Robbie, I'm only going to hire you if you've done 40 years of Z shell configuration. Like, I could care less about the technology, because the thing that I'm hiring someone to do is to transcend the stack that they're working on, transcend the framework, and be a person who is open to learning and to molding whatever the stack is in front of them into what their mind is, their brain thoughts at that point. And so when I go to hire a junior developer, I ask them, well, what would we do if we wanted to fix this problem? And I don't care about the code. I want to hear their thinking process. I want to hear how they're solving this problem, right? And 9 times out of 10, the junior developer, there's a thing in martial arts called like beginner's mind, where you come to a problem fresh. You're not burdened by the sins of the past, right? Junior developers, the best at that, right? They're like, well, couldn't we just not ask them? And we're like, oh, that's a great answer. We should just not be asking them. Let's just do that, right? Now they need help, right? Like they're learning a stack. But if you hire a senior developer into your company and they're the best senior developer and they never worked in your stack, are you going to be like, oh, I'm mad that I have to help you? Like, no, you're going to help that person, right? And so my take is we should be hiring way more junior developers. We should be giving them opportunities because they're better in many ways, and they're the only way that this profession, this trade, if you will, is going to survive, is if we have them in it.
Hey folks, it's Robbie here. Software doesn't age well on its own. It slows down, gets messy, and holds teams back. At Planet Argon, we help organizations clean up legacy code, reduce technical debt, and modernize their web applications and APIs. Whether you need extra hands or just the right expertise, we're here to help. We specialize in Ruby on Rails, React, Laravel, and more. If your software is stuck in the past, send them our way. Visit planetargon.com. Again, that's planetargon.com. All right, back to the show. I agree with a lot of those points there. We've always, up until I think in the last few years, but we've for a long time had an internship program. The thing what we did with our internship program was we started that when we were in the office together, and like we had people coming from the local university or from the local coding camps, and that would be like the end of their curriculum. So they'd come with us for several months and stuff. And we couldn't always hire them. So we were always, one of our approaches was like, well, we're going to be able to do this for you. And then we're going to do our best to try to help you find a job, and but this is a clear cut, like here we have some interesting real world projects for you. Do as much as we can to kind of help ramp you up to kind of gift you off to the world, is take that next steps and be a stepping stone. And I think a lot of companies that are trying to hire people might try to navigate like, well, do we have the time for it? Or do we have the budget for it right now? We just had layoffs. How can we bring in junior people if we just, laid people off in the last year or two? And like everybody's at least a lot of companies I talk to, they're nervous about how the optics of it. And I'm like, but we have to start, I think, if anything, if you're trying to provide stability, just kind of like thinking out loud here, if you're trying to convey stability, I don't think there's any better way to show stability that you're willing to invest in the future, people that may or may not be working with you, in the future.
I mean, can you afford not to hire junior developers? Should really be the conversation, right? Like, can you afford to say, I don't want to train someone up in my domain. I want to only hire the best people who know exactly what is already happening. Like, that means you're probably going to have a lot of jobs just sit vacant, frankly. Or you're not going to have, you're going to have people who are going to come in and expect everything to operate in a certain way. Like, that's one of the great things about hiring junior developers is, again, they don't come with a bunch of baggage. They come with, you can tell them like, hey, this is how we do this stuff here. And they're like, great, I've never done it anywhere anyway. So they're really easy. They're moldable. They have that beginner's mind in that way. I want to hit on something from my past, which is I worked for Living Social. And one of the things that drew me to working there was the fact that they saw this problem. This is 10 years ago now. And they saw this problem and they started a boot camp within the company called Hungry Academy. And they basically, I actually don't know how the admissions process was. I wasn't there when they started that, but they pulled in all these people. They basically said, we're going to have a boot camp. You can sign up, you can come in, and we're going to teach you Ruby. We're going to basically, and then once we're done with this, you're a full-fledged employee. Right. We're going to basically just like, not even junior developers, non-developers in a way. We're going to basically bring you all the way up. And a number of them had done some development before that. And that team, so I consider that a team, there's like 30 people. I had the pleasure of actually giving them a lecture all about concurrency, about how it's different than parallelism and all this stuff. And I cannot tell you that group of people is one of my most favorite group of people because I have worked with them accidentally a bunch since then. And I keep tabs on them. Like, oh, what's this person doing? Oh, what's this person doing? Oh, shout out to Mary. Mary she moved on. She's actually a PM now because that's what she really wanted to do. I look at that and I say, I'd never think about it like, oh, what an expenditure this company had. They put all these people on the books and they didn't get any value out of them. And I think of the amount of value they got out of them is massive. And I think that in a way, I thank them for what they did for the community, for giving those people that opportunity and putting them into our industry. And in that same way, if you're at a company and you're thinking, how can I afford to hire junior people? I would say you are going to need that person in a year, in 2 years. Maybe you're going to need them in 5 years because they're going to be the best person that is a person that knows email front to back. And you're going to need that, or whatever it is, you're going to need them. Right. And in that same way, like we need to be hiring them so that they exist in the industry. It doesn't take that long. It doesn't take that long to get someone to get an intelligent person up to speed on coding. That did algebra in school. It takes them a year, and you wouldn't even call them a junior programmer. It's like, great, you need them in a year. Give them that opportunity.
Thanks for digging into that with me and sharing some of those, personal stories there as well, and your experiences at Living Social, and being able to have those types of programs. And I hope we see a resurgence of this in the near future. I'm going to stay hopeful for that and do whatever I can to help make that happen myself. Another thing you had touched on was, you talked about that project for like the JSON patch project, and you mentioned someone responding to something like, this is a dead project or what have you. How do you think about, because it's something I hear, I've seen this a lot when team members on my team even, or when I see people talking about what third-party open source library might we use, like a Ruby gem, or, what package might we pull into this project? And they'll be looking at a couple different options, and they'll look at things like, well, how recently is the recent commit? Like, what sort of signals do you think about when you might pull in a package into the projects you're working on, or what? Because some people I'm thinking like there are projects that are kind of done and they don't need a lot of work, but they haven't necessarily needed to be touched in 2 or 3 years. And someone might look at that and be like, well, this project seems dead. And then they might not use it. So how do you?
I take a pre-step on this, which is to say that is the functionality that I need something that I should vendor, that I should basically pull in and just have it live with us. Because there's a bunch of things that are small enough that you're like, I actually don't want to have an external dependency on. Like maybe it's just a one-liner, maybe it's a class, maybe it's a thing that I know is going to be sort of intrinsic to the domain of the problem that I'm working on, and that this thing does like most of it. Maybe I want to just pull it in. I want to just own it. I want to make it our own, right? I start there. I start with looking at it and being like, how much of it, what do I want? How much of this do I want? Do I really just want this one little piece, and kind of get away with not adding a dependency and just, copying it in and just owning, maybe I'm copying it, maybe I'm writing it from scratch, whatever it is, right? So that's my pre-step. And then I move on from there. So I move on from there to say, I do evaluations. I will be like, oh, does this thing work? Like, let me try to use it. Does it do the thing that I need it to do? Right? Because sometimes you find the answer is no. Like sometimes you're like, okay, great. Like that should be the minimum bar. Like, did it do what I wanted it to do? Just straight up. And then I'll move on to a secondary thing. And there's 2 signals that I use for this. I look at what are your released versions, because everywhere has some sort of release versions, right? And if it's like, this is the 0.1 and it was done 3 years ago, I have released plenty of 0.1s from 3 years ago, and they didn't do almost anything yet, right? Like, in other words, I look at that and I say, the mind of the person who did this is probably like, I don't really care about this. I haven't done anything on it, right? Maybe I'll look at the number of commits, right, on it or something like that. And then I'll move on to say, like, if I see a 0.1 that it's hard to go down from a 0.1. Let's just say this is a 0.4 that was released a day ago, but 0.3 and 0.2 and 0.1 were released in 4 consecutive days. I go like, oh, we're still getting our feet. We're still getting started. Great. No problem. Like, you do you, King. It's all good. And then I will sort of move on to say there's this differential between the version number and the last time it was updated, and then a sprinkling of how long has this been going on. If it's like a version number that's just not at the beginning, it actually doesn't even matter what it is. It just can't be like within like 0.5. If it's a number like that and it was released, like a while ago, and it has a ton of commits, it tells me this person is just a craftsman. They're just out there, like they really were honing it. And they never really got it to a place where it made sense to release a version number. Probably is fine. If it's got a really high version number, then usually that's an indication that this person is like really into like, I want to release software. I need to release software all the time. And then I'll like look and say like, okay, what is the spread of these versions? I'm on version 5, but I'm on 5.0. What was 4.0 from last week? Like, what are we doing? If 4.0 is from 2 years ago, great. That's all. I almost don't need to know anything more than that. And so it's all about this like, I should maybe write this. There's an equation in here somewhere, but it's basically like what you're looking for is care. How much care has the person put into this, regardless of how long they've been working on it? So if they put a lot of care into it and they got it to a finished state, you can sort of surmise that, what version number it is, how long did they work on it. Like I use a bunch of projects that haven't been updated in 8 years, but if you look at the number of commits that they did 8 to 10 years ago was like a gangbusters. And then it got to this point and that was just like, they abandoned it and it works great. Yeah, I don't care. Use it, right? We're all good. And so it's this, again, it's a little bit of a mouthfeel, but you can really get a feel for like, is this person put care into it? Have they gotten it to have they gotten it to a plateau?
I look forward to your blog post where you write up this algorithm. I think this would be really helpful for everybody out there.
It's going to be like a, pins and yarn kind of algorithm, I think. So
do other signals like the number of downloads like on Ruby gems or like, does that come into play, or does that seem like, well, I don't care about the popular thing necessarily, but
when I'm looking at Go packages instead, there's no download numbers. And so I don't really care. Like it doesn't go into the calculus for me for the most part.
I sometimes wonder if those numbers are actually that helpful to the wider community. Also, it's interesting because it becomes like an interesting vanity metric that people are kind of proud of. Like the funny thing about, say, Oh My Z Shell, there's no versions. It's literally, you just pull down from the master branch. And like, it's always done as far as I'm concerned. But because of that, I don't have releases. I don't know how many people have downloaded it. GitHub doesn't provide details on like unique. I can't go back over the history and be like, how many unique people cloned this repository and how do you distinguish between another Git pull? That's even beside whether or not it's even a good project or not. It's used project, but it's just like
sure. I mean, in some ways, you'd like to know just as a signal. Are there people here? Should I, and I think that you're having to use secondary signals. Do I get a lot of issues? Do I get a lot of pull requests? Do I get you have to use something else in order to try to like derive that value, that signal.
How many people have complained about it on Twitter or whatever?
Right. It's a good derivative signal. It's a good side channel. So
cool. I have a couple of quick last questions for you, Evan, as we wrap up. First, is there a non-software, non-technical book that you find yourself recommending to peers?
I always recommend Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson to peers, especially. If we're having a talk about psychology and anxiety, there's a book called The Inner Game of Tennis, which is because tennis is largely a mental game. You're out there by yourself and you have to figure it out. And it's a sports psychologist, and it happens to be written by a forward. And I found it because I went to University of Southern California, and the football coach would talk about this book. And so that's how I ended up finding it. But it's a great book for that.
Did you play football?
No. Just, Pete Carroll's his name. He's a very gregarious guy. And so he was talking about it like on a news program or whatever. And then he ends up writing, if you look it up on Amazon, you can find the version with him writing the foreword. So he ended up basically talking about it so much that they're like, we should re-release it with Pete Carroll doing a little blurb at the beginning. So yeah.
Awesome. I had not heard of that one before. So I'll include links to both those for our listeners in the show notes. And where can listeners best follow your work or keep up on Miren's progress online?
Miren is at miren.dev. URL-wise, I'm on Blue Sky as at evanphx.dev. I think that's kind of it these days, if I'm honest.
Oh, excellent. I'll include links to all that for everybody in the show notes. And with that, it's been such a delight having you join us in Maintainable, Evan. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us.
Absolutely. It's great being here.
You've been listening to Maintainable, a Planet Argon production. Editing by Claudia Armbruster. Post-production by Autumn Morgan and Ellis Fenson. Emotional support from the letter M. For Maintainable, for momentum, for making things better. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Keep showing up. See you next time. Maintainable.